They say that everyone's knowledge of history begins the day they were born. Context is certainly a large part of any history, but if you're in commercial real estate, specifically apartments, I assure you that there are things you should know. And I assure you that the story began long before the day you were born. Except maybe Sam Zell. He probably knows all the stories. Commercial real estate is not as much an industry as it is a long and glorious story of big dreams, brilliant thinkers, and deal makers addicted to the craft of housing. There's land and loans and lumber, but mostly there's strategy, timing, and partnerships. All developers, owners, and operators leave a path of housing in their wake, but few leave a legacy like the extraordinary Archstone. Without history, there is no context, and without Archstone, the history of apartments is far less grand. And so I am delighted to welcome an old friend, Neil Brown, now CEO of the next chapter, ArchCo. Neil was on the show a few weeks back, and we barely scratched the surface of his story. Neil, welcome back.
Oh, thank you, Linda. I'm glad to be back. Thank you.
Neil, let's start with Archstone. Formed in 1998, split between Equity and Avalon Bay in 2013, Archstone remains one of the nation's largest owners and operators ever. Every great company starts with a visionary. Who were the people behind Archstone, and what was the vision?
Well, let's go back in time, even before then, to 1963, because that was the genesis of the company that eventually became Archstone. It was Property Capital Trust. I think that was the name. That was a long time ago, 1963. And in Bill Sanders, Ron Blankenship, Scott Sellers, and other luminaries of the industry took this company, made it Security Capital Pacific, which was a West Coast oriented apartment development and owner and manager, and subsequently started an East Coast version of that, Security Capital Atlantic. And in 1998, which was the date you mentioned, is when those two companies, Security Capital Pacific and Security Capital Atlantic, merged to become Archstone. And that was the start of it. And the idea was to have a national company owning apartments in sort of the great markets. The original company had a lot of stuff in Texas, particularly in El Paso, and the idea was to sell those over time and reinvest the proceeds in the top tier markets in America.
How did Archstone grow to be the largest apartment owner in the country?
Good access to capital. We went public in 1998, and we were able to continually grow our capital base through acquisitions. Our largest acquisition was the Charles E. Smith Company in Washington, D.C., and I want to say that occurred in 2001. It practically doubled the size of Archstone, and then we traded in and out of apartments and got rid of sort of the moderate things we own, reinvested them into more upscale projects, which as we improved the quality of the portfolio, it continued to attract attention from capital sources, which gave us a pretty good stream of capital to continue to deploy through Archstone.
Archstone created a powerful brand. Post may have started apartment branding in Atlanta with its tulips, but it was regional. How important was branding to Archstone's success?
Linda, that's a very interesting question, and I might ask the question slightly differently, which is, if we hadn't branded ourselves, would we have ended up in the same place? So I think the answer to the question is it was important, but I think there were more fundamentally important aspects to the company. Primary is culture. I think a great culture can lead to great success if you also have a well-defined strategy or a great strategy to go along with it. The branding was one element of our strategy, but it was just one element. The other elements were location, maybe location again, and then location a third time, as is true in every real estate investment. The branding, I think, was just sort of icing on the cake. It certainly gave us a national name. It helped with operations. We had policies that somebody could move from one Archstone project to another Archstone project anywhere in the country for basically no fee. So it was easy for them to go find where the other apartments were. Frankly, it made it easier to name the projects. I mean, kind of a silly little thing, but you end up spending an inordinate amount of time naming a project, coming up with a marketing campaign for the project, all the things that go along with branding. So in some ways, it simplified life a little bit too. But fundamentally, it was about the culture. It was about the strategy. It was certainly about the people. And then the branding part was an added piece that I think made it successful.
How did Archstone get into trouble?
The world collapsed. We were a public company from 1998 until 2007. We were taken private by Barclays, Bank of America, Lehman Brothers, and Tishman Speyer. And it just so happened that they took us private at the essentially the peak of the cycle. So shortly after we were private, the wheels came off the world. The Great Recession hit. Our valuations plummeted, as did all real estate. And for the next basically 6 years, we sort of struggled as I wouldn't say we struggled, but we had companies that owned us that kind of didn't want to own us. Barclays, B of A, and Lehman had no intention of holding us for 6 years. They were going to take us private and then syndicate off the ownership. But the timing was such that it wasn't possible. So we ended up being owned by them for a number of years. And despite that, we still were able to build projects. We built some very nice projects. During that time frame, we worked on City Center, DC, which is a remarkable billion-dollar project in the heart of the District of Columbia that we developed in partnership with Hines. So I hesitate to use the word trouble. We were a private company. We still were developing. We were still acquiring. We were still managing. But we just weren't as visible as we had been before, simply because we no longer issued quarterly statements or annual statements and things like that. But we continued to operate the business, and people continued to live in our apartments, and I think we continued to do a very good job at that time.
What lessons should people in the industry take from the rise and fall of Archstone?
I think the biggest thing that we all had to live through was just simply, and this wasn't just Archstone, but the Great Recession, it was just getting up and going to do your job every day when things just felt disastrous. We downsized the company. We particularly downsized development during that time, and that was a very difficult time, very brutal to have to lay off. I think we laid off in the development group 75% of the people, and that's just a difficult time to go through. But you realize that that's sort of how companies rejuvenate themselves. Plenty of companies have gone through tough times and come back. Plenty have gone through tough times and not succeeded. And I think more than anything else, it just takes an amount of fortitude to say, we'll get through this. On our last segment, you may remember that I said one of my favorite phrases is, "This too shall pass," and true in good times, true in bad times. And as long as you keep that in mind and keep at whatever it is you're doing, I think there's generally a pretty good chance that you'll get through the tough times.
I think that's a brilliant point. I thought my family came up with that. Maybe not.
They may have. I can't swear I know where I got it from.
I think we all think we did.
Yeah.
Well, that's really the past. And looking to the future, you recently launched ArchCo. Tell us about your decision to do it all again and the steps from there to here.
Well, it turns out that recent was 8 years ago. It's easy to think that it was a year or two or three, and even I forget how long ago it was until I actually do the math. I started the company in 2013. It was right after Archstone had been bought. And I was deliberating with myself as to what to do next. If anything, I thought briefly about retiring. I was a little young then to retire. I'm probably not too young now to retire, and occasionally think about it, but not in a serious fashion. But it was more happenstance that it got launched as fast as it did. Two guys that had worked for me at Archstone called me up and said, "Hey, we have a project that we want to try to buy. Would you be our partner and help us with the project?" And they had a very short time fuse to make a decision. So with probably not enough thought, I said, "Sure, I'm in." And sort of in the course of a weekend plus a couple of weeks to discuss the business strategy, we formed a company, and that actually started out as K&R Partners, which is an affiliate of ArchCo. But that led to, over time, that led to the ArchCo creation.
So what are your plans for ArchCo? Are you building another empire?
I most assuredly am not building another empire. When I started at Archstone, I was, 1996, I was 30 years old, which seems like a lifetime ago. And I guess it was a lifetime ago. And it was fun, and it was demanding, and it was absorbing. And I'm at a point now in life where I want to make sure that I'm doing the things in life that I enjoy. I wouldn't trade my Archstone days for anything. They were absolutely fabulous. But it was just an enormous amount of work. I mean, we had one of the largest development pipelines in the U.S. When Archstone got bought, the pipeline was about a $6 billion pipeline to be spread over some number of years. And I'm just not interested in that anymore. I want to do a small number of projects, start a couple every year, maybe 3. Have a little bit more hands-on than I had at Archstone. At Archstone, at some point, I finally had to sort of take my fingerprints and thumbprints off of everything. I couldn't make the choices on colors or on floor plans. I looked at all those things, but for a couple of reasons, I couldn't. One is I just didn't have the time to look at them all. But 2 is, if you want good people to work for you, you can't make all their decisions for them. And so one of the hardest things that I had to do was, from a personal perspective, was I had to pull myself away from the decisions that rightfully are made by the development partner, by the development associate. Making decisions on finishes and floor plans and colors and the things that energize them. They energized me also, but if I did them, they wouldn't have the enjoyment of doing those things, and I wouldn't have been able to keep the number of people that I kept over the years. I think, I want to say, in the entire time I was there, I think I only had 2 or 3 people leave me voluntarily for a better job, for a different position, for something else. Everybody else was happy in the culture, was happy with the way they were allowed the freedom to make decisions. And I think right now I'm enjoying getting back to those kinds of decisions. I still don't do it to the level that I did when I was the primary developer. I still have development partners, but I feel much more comfortable giving them my opinion. And frankly, they're mature enough to know that when I give them my opinion, it's simply my opinion. It's not a directive. It's not a demand that they do something. It really is, hey, look, this is how I think about it, but if you have a different opinion, I'm happy to let you make the decision. But I am closer to that now, and I enjoy that. And I just don't, the idea of getting on an airplane and going to visit, 10 different markets and looking at land in 10 or 12 different markets, just doesn't excite me like it used to. Part of that's age, maturity, things like that. So we're not going to create an empire. We have, and hopefully we'll continue to have, a small development company that plays in markets that are easy for me to get to, but no grand plan to make this a big empire.
What advice would you give those greenhorns, or maybe those with 5 or 10 years in?
Oh, wow. I have so much advice that we couldn't tape it all. Let me see if I can, let me start with a few. And part of this is obviously lessons learned by me over the years. One of the fundamental choices is what market do you participate in? Where do you want to live? What's the real estate market in that area? And it is surprising, but that decision is probably far more important than people realize. Certainly more important than I think I realized when I got into the business. But choice of initial market, or choice of markets to work in, kind of can almost define your success in the business. There are some people who will do better if they go to a less competitive market, a secondary market, a tertiary market, and stay there and develop in that market for decades and be perfectly happy. There are some markets that I think have longer term success, what I would call margin of safety. DC is the best example I can give you. You can be an average developer in the DC area and you'll be successful, maybe phenomenally successful. If you're an average developer in Houston, you will go out of business. The competition, the levels of competition between those two markets is astounding. I don't remember the starts right now, but a number of years ago I looked at it, and the starts in DC were 5,000, 10,000 starts a year. In Houston, you could have a 20,000, 30,000 unit start in 1 year, and the markets are not so dissimilar in size that you can say, oh well, Houston's starting more because they need more apartments. They're starting more because it's easier. If it's easier, it makes the return on investment lower. It also makes the margin of profitability narrower. So you have to be really good. So for those who are up for a challenge and want to go compete in the toughest markets, then you go where everybody's building and you try to succeed. To me, that's I don't know that I would want to do that. If, on the other hand, not that it's easy to develop in DC, it's still hard, but once you have a piece of land in DC, once you control land in DC, you don't have the torrential downpour of competition trying to ruin your project that you might get in the Houstons or the Dallases or Phoenix or other markets like that. So as a new person in the industry, the first thing I would say is figure out what you want. Do you want to develop complex projects? Go to the big cities, go to DC, go to New York, go to Boston, or some of the California markets. Are you satisfied doing the same thing over and over again? When I was at Crow in South Florida, we built the same project, I don't know how many times, but we just, it was like little cookie cutter things. You just build the same thing. And that was fine. It was profitable. You didn't have to recreate the wheel every time you did a project. So if you want to do that, maybe go to some of the secondary markets or even the tertiary markets. So that's probably point one, is choose your market. Point two is, or not point two, but the second thing I want people to understand as they're getting into the market, into the industry, this is a risky business in terms of making money, losing money, the ability to lose money. And there are a lot of people far more comfortable with things like recourse debt than I am. And I think the company that does risk management the best is probably TCR, Trammell Crow Residential. So many people have gone through Trammell Crow and gone to other companies that the risk management formula that Trammell Crow had, I think, has been spread to other companies as well. So there's much more awareness of risk than there used to be. But I think there are too many people who don't seriously consider what can happen if things go badly. So I think that's a vital thing to do. And one of my prior bosses, a guy named Bob Spiker, who's with Trammell Crow, his question to me was, well, what if you're wrong? My naive answer to him was, well, I'm not wrong. So he would ask it again. Okay, but what if you are? Well, Bob, I've looked at this and I've looked at that and I've looked at the market. And after I explained all that, he would ask it a third time. Okay, but what if you're wrong? And then I finally understood what he was saying. It wasn't a prediction. It was simply a question of, okay, you did the analysis right. Everything is supposed to work out the way you say. But what if it doesn't? What if there's a Great Recession? What if there's a pandemic? What if there's a crash in 1986? Although I worked with him a little bit later than that, so that was probably not feasible. But it was really the exogenous factors that he was worried about, that he was asking me to consider, that were well beyond my control, but still could have a huge impact on the projects that we were doing. One of my partners who also worked with Bob was a former Navy guy, and he had the same question, although he asked it slightly differently. It was, in his case, it was more of a statement than a question. He said, we can take no hits below the waterline. Basically meaning if a ship gets hit below the waterline, it's sinking. You can take hits above the waterline and you'll be fine. You can patch them, you can go on. But they were both saying the same thing. What's the downside? Even though you're not predicting the downside, what is the 1 in 5 or 1 in 20, 1 in 30, 1 in 40 chance of things going wrong? And what happens to us as a partnership if those things occur? Do we go out of business, a hit below the waterline, or do we lose a little bit of money and every partner is a little worse off, but nobody is in the bread lines and nobody is out of business, which would be the hits above the waterline? That was a fundamentally transforming question for me that, like I said, it took me a little while to fully grasp what Bob was trying to explain to me. But after that, I fully embraced the concept. I asked that question a lot. I asked my partners that question a lot. I asked myself that question a lot. What if we're wrong? What happens if things don't go the way we want to? So like Trammell Crow, we've adopted a risk management, risk aversion template. We ask ourselves what could go wrong. We think about those things. And I would just say to the younger crowd, make sure that somewhere on your checklist as you think about projects, that question is one of the questions that you ask yourself. What if we're wrong? Despite all of our great analysis, what are the worst things that can happen to us? So I think that's a second lesson that I would encourage people to learn.
Those are great points.
Along those same lines, I would say, don't be afraid to make money slowly. Everybody's anxious to make money. If you're an apartment developer, your goal is to make money. Of course, we want to provide housing. Of course, we want people to live in our apartments. But fundamentally, in a capitalistic society, we're trying to make money. And when I say don't be afraid to make money slowly, what I'm really saying is don't take imprudent risks. If you make a big hit on a project, don't double down and risk it. And then if that works out well, double down again, because one of those double downs isn't going to work out. And if you have continued to take risk on each one, you're going to likely go out of business. And the real estate world is filled with people like that. At some point, it's so easy to begin to believe that you are smarter than the markets. And I'll tell you a story about a colleague of mine, a guy named John Carmichael. John passed away a number of years ago, but it was right about the time that I was joining JPI, and he and a guy named Mike Doremus were leaving Rosewood in Dallas to join JPI. And John and Mike were down in Florida with me. We were driving around looking at sites, spent all day doing it. So we had plenty of time in the car to talk. And John started to say something to me. We'd gotten on the subject of risk and things like that. And John started to say something to me, and he said, "Oh, wait a second, I got to show you this." So he opens this briefcase, and his briefcase was the emptiest briefcase I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it had like 2 pens, no papers, no calculator or anything. And he goes fishing around this briefcase in little pockets, and he pulls out a 3x5 card. And he hands me the 3x5 card and said, "Neil, this is the most important thing you can know." And on the card it said, "Don't believe your own bullshit." And I just thought that was hilarious. But he lived it. I mean, he said, "Look, we sell so much. We are always optimistic. We're developers. But don't fall into the trap of thinking that all of the analysis that you've done, all of the things that you think that you know are going to come out true." And in many ways, it was the same lesson that Bob Spiker and my other partner, a guy named Jim Billick, the Navy guy, had to say, all said in slightly different ways, of things may not turn out the way you want them to. So just don't tie yourself up too much into it. Don't invest too much capital. Don't double down. Don't think you're smarter than the market. Have some risk aversion, and stay in business. And if you stay in business, you'll be successful.
Well said. Well said. We say don't believe your own press clippings. So probably
Exactly
every industry has a very similar grounding.
That is exactly right. And one of my you'll hear over time. There are a number of quotes that I like. One of the quotes is from Ben Franklin. "Bigger boats can venture far, but little boats should stick near shore." And I think that's true. If you're Archstone, if you're Equity Residential, if you're Avalon, if you're Alliance, there are things that you can do that the smaller companies shouldn't try to do. The risk they shouldn't try to take. So just a good thing to keep in mind.
That's fantastic. And on that note, this boat has sailed. Another great show, Neil. Thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. And I'm going to end this with 2 quotes. One is Henry Ford: "Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right." I think that's a powerful little quote. And the other quote, I keep this card on my desk. "Dream no small dreams, for they have no power to move the hearts of men." It's a wonderful little quote that reminds me that what we do is important. And if you try to do important things, you'll get people to work with you to do those things. But anyway, Linda, thank you very much. It was great seeing you again, and look forward to talking again in the future.
Wonderful. We hope to have you back. It goes to show there's always more to learn.
It does. Thank you.
In life, but especially in multifamily, lessons can be expensive, even painful. Don't believe me? Ask Tishman Speyer or Lehman Brothers. We begin by knowing history and then following success. We look forward to following Neil and ArchCo into the next big adventure and all that brings. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed our show. See you on our next NAHB Power Hitters.